You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Menstruation has a long history of being a taboo topic. In fact, in the United States, there was a formal ban on advertising any products that talked about menstruation until 1972. However, when that ban was finally lifted, menstrual products like tampons, pads, and PMS remedies were suddenly all over the place. I remember seeing a lot of these ads as a kid growing up in the 1980s and 90s, but as someone who received very little sex education, I really didn't understand what they were advertising. So I started asking. And one of the things I asked about was PMS. And the answer I always got was, oh, it's that time of the month when women get cranky. And that was really sort of the common narrative around PMS that the advertisements reinforced. For example, one ad in 1990 featured a woman who literally said, and I'm quoting word for word here, "Your whole being changes and you become this irritable, cranky witch." So culturally, PMS was really framed as this inevitable misery that women had to endure for a portion of each month. And that's still the way that a lot of people today think about it. But it's time to change what you think you know about PMS and also to break some of the stereotypes about it. In today's show, we're going to do a deep dive into the science of PMS and the menstrual cycle more broadly. We're going to break down the hormonal changes that happen during the menstrual cycle and how they affect women's brains and bodies. We're also going to talk about how estrogen and progesterone affect women's sexual desire and behavior and how their sexuality changes throughout the cycle and why this is so important for women and their partners to understand. I am joined by Dr. Sarah Hill. She is author of This Is Your Brain on Birth Control and a researcher who has spent most of her 2-decade career studying women, relationships, and health. In addition to having established an award-winning health and relationships lab at TCU, she has published nearly 100 academic research articles and is a much sought-after public speaker. Her latest book is titled The Period Brain, The New Science of Why We PMS and How to Fix It. This is going to be another fascinating conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Sexless marriages and relationships are more common than you think. Studies find that as many as 1 in 7 married couples can be categorized as sexless, and most of them find it to be highly distressing. It can leave partners with low self-esteem, trigger frequent conflict, exacerbate emotional distance, and sometimes even lead to breakup or divorce. But it doesn't have to be this way. That's where Paired comes in, the #1 couples app that helps to improve your relationship and that takes just minutes each day. Curated by relationship therapists, Paired uses expert-backed research to support making a lasting impact for couples. Here's how it works. You and your partner download the app and pair together. Every day, Paired sends you a 5-minute game, quiz, or question designed to deepen your relationship. Answer on your own time, and once you're done, Paired will reveal your partner's responses so that you can have an open, stress-free, honest conversation. One of my personal favorite parts of the app are the couples games, like Yes, No, Maybe, Romantic Gestures, and What's Your Couple Style? These shared activities are great ways to start the process of sexually reconnecting. They give you the prompt you need to start sharing things about each other, to learn about each other's current wants and needs, and to find your common ground. My partner and I have found them to be very useful in our own life for maintaining a deeper connection. Practice making your relationship a priority every day with Paired. Head to paired.com/Justin to get a 7-day free trial and 25% off if you sign up for a subscription. That's paired.com/Justin to sign up today. For nearly 80 years, the Kinsey Institute has been the place where sex and relationships are understood. Now, you can help advance its expert-led research. This month, the Match Group is offering an incredible 2-to-1 match for all gifts to the Kinsey Institute Research Fund in recognition of its vital impact. Your donation will help fund important research on topics such as sexual well-being and aging, sexual assault prevention, shifting dating trends, and the impact of AI and technology on relationships. Donate now to help maintain the Kinsey Institute as the global hub to explore, discover, and share knowledge about sexuality, relationships, and human behavior. Be part of this crowdfunding campaign and make your gift to the Kinsey Institute Research Fund go further this October. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to participate in the Make Your Match campaign and support sex science. Hi, Sarah, and welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me back. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. So let's start by talking a little bit about the story behind your new book, The Period Brain. So you start at the beginning of it by talking about how most women, assuming they're not on hormonal birth control, will have this thing that we call PMS for the last half of each menstrual cycle. And you had the revelation that biologically, it doesn't make a lot of sense for women to have an inherited tendency to feel like shit for half the time, right? So talk to us a little bit about sort of the light bulb moment that led you to question what's up with this and why do I really need to dive into this and try and understand it better?
Yeah, so my background is using an evolutionary perspective to try to understand human behavior. And so I've spent my entire career understanding the function served by different traits that humans possess. And among these are some of the hormonal changes that we see in women's psychology and their behavior. And there's been a lot of focus in my field on the role of estrogen and estrogen in terms of promoting things related to attraction and sex. You and I talked a little bit about these things when we talked last. I'm sure you've talked with other guests about these things too.
Mhm.
But there's these really lovely, beautiful, sensical things that go on when estrogen is high and rising in the cycle, where it increases women's attractiveness. It makes them smell better to men. It makes them sound better. Their voices sound better. They look sexier. They move sexier. They want more sex. They have more sex. I mean, there's all these things, sex, sex, sex. And it all makes evolutionary sense because this is the time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception. And so makes a lot of sense that women inherited a tendency to be overtly sexual at this time and when conception is possible. And so there had been a lot of focus on this in my field, and I really started to think, what is going on the rest of the cycle? When you look at estrogen and the types of psychological and behavioral changes that happen in response to estrogen, it all does make a whole lot of sense. And when you look at progesterone, and it's like if we look at progesterone and what's going on in the body, just sort of as an evolutionary task analysis, it's like this is the time in the cycle when implantation is possible. And it's essentially laying the groundwork for the possibility of pregnancy. And when you look at the types of psychological and behavioral changes that women experience in the second half of the cycle, it doesn't seem to make as much sense as what's going on during the first half of the cycle, right? Because it just seems like it just looks like PMS. Like if you ask women about, hey, how do you feel during the last 2 weeks of your cycle? And in fact, this was something that we did. We just asked women, like, tell us words that pop into your head when you think about the last 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle. And we had women write down, everything that was sort of going through their minds when they were thinking about this point in the cycle. And from this, we created a word cloud that I actually have in the book. And what you can see is it's like full of unpleasantness. It's like tired, sad, hungry, angry. It's this whole cornucopia of unpleasantness. And so I was like really curious evolutionarily, what's this all about? And like, what does this have to do with implantation and pregnancy? And so it was then that I began to really dive into what is it that progesterone is actually doing? Because given from an evolutionary perspective, what it should be doing is getting all of, our different bits and pieces all working together toward this goal of implantation and pregnancy. And then, so like, is there some of that going on? And then also like, what's up with some of this other stuff, right? What's up with some of the things that women report feeling like, like low libido, like they don't have any energy, feeling like they're craving food. And so like, what's the story with all of that? And so I sort of began this deep dive into the science of progesterone to try to better understand if there was a way to make sense of the second half of the cycle.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And, something you talk about in the book is how there's a lot of scientific research out there on the role of estrogen, but not so much on the role of progesterone. And I think that's part of the reason why we just don't know as much about this is because it hasn't been the focus of nearly as much scientific attention.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that when you look at the publication rate of papers that are looking at progesterone versus estrogen, it's like 2 to 1 in terms of the focus. And part of that is just, science is a human endeavor and estrogen is really sexy. I mean, it just is. It causes all of these, physical, psychological, behavioral changes that are just like, it's just sex, sex, sex. And that's fun to study. Everybody wants a part of that. And so there's a lot of people in that space because it is really fun to study. Estrogen is also easier to understand in a lot of ways
Hmm.
because when you're looking at its effects on our psychology and behavior, it's easier to isolate because in the first half of the cycle, you're really only getting estrogen release, whereas in the second half of the cycle, when progesterone is rising and falling, you also get a second rise and fall of estrogen. And so it's a little bit harder to isolate. And a lot of the things that it is related to just aren't fun. It's like grumpiness and like being angry, low libido. Like nobody wants to study that. It's not a lot of fun.
Right. Yeah. And, when people talk about sex hormones, they primarily talk about estrogen versus testosterone. And we just don't hear as much about progesterone. And I think a lot of people just don't realize, like, hey, that's another really important sex hormone that we need to talk about.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, like, of course, men were studied first, right? And so there was this idea that, okay, well, men have this one hormone, and oh, look, women have one too, and it's estrogen. And in some ways, I think that the analog between estrogen and testosterone, I mean, there's some appropriateness to this because men have one primary sex hormone because men's bodies only have one job that they have to do for reproduction, and that's have sex. Right. So testosterone is kind of the hormone of mating effort, right? It's just all about sex and doing all of the things that are ultimately going to get you in a position to have sex. And so when we look at women's hormones, it's like we have to have two hormones instead of one because our bodies have to do two different jobs in order to reproduce. We have to have sex, right? And that's what estrogen's for, right? It's getting us all primed and ready and maximally attractive and maximally able to distinguish differences between potential partners as a way to promote conception. But then our body has to totally shift gears and do a completely different set of activities in order to promote pregnancy, right? And so we have to have two hormones a cycle because our bodies have to do two jobs instead of just one when it comes to reproduction.
Yeah. So, in order to understand PMS and all the stuff that you talk about in the book, we really need to understand the menstrual cycle and how it works. So, can you kind of give us the layperson understanding of just sort of walk us through the cycle and what is happening during a menstrual cycle?
Yeah, yeah. So, it's funny because it's like when you hear like even me and I've, spent a lot of time thinking about the cycle. When you hear menstrual cycle, you just think, oh yeah, your period.
Right.
And you're like, yeah, no, that's your period. But there's so much more to it than that because really a cycle is this period of time where your body is doing everything that it needs to do in order to reproduce. And it's really amazing given that women's bodies have to shift gears between a state that's sort of optimized for attraction and sex and then shift into a state that's optimized for implantation and pregnancy. It's really remarkable that our bodies are able to do this every roughly 28 days. And the way that it all starts is on the first day of the cycle is the day that you get your period. So your period starts, and at this point, your levels of sex hormone are really low. So this is actually when women's hormones are lowest across the cycle. And, it's kind of ironic because women oftentimes are given kind of a hard time during their periods and like, oh, you're hormonal. And it's like, that's like literally when our hormones are at their absolute lowest.
Mhm.
So our problem is actually that we're not hormonal. So hormones are really low. And when hormones are really low, this actually sends a signal to the hypothalamus in the brain to start stimulating the ovaries that they need to start working on egg follicle generation and like getting ready to ovulate. And so the brain will start telling the ovaries to start producing some egg follicles. And as these egg follicles start to mature, that actually causes the release of estrogen. And so that's actually where most of our estrogen comes from, is from this process of our ovaries being stimulated and eggs beginning to mature. Ultimately, one egg begins to fully mature, and that then leads to an increase in estrogen. And so estrogen rises and rises and rises as an egg gets ready to be released. And then it peaks right prior to ovulation, which generally happens right around day 14 of the cycle, so about 2 weeks in. And then an egg is released, right? And right prior to that time that an egg is released, estrogen is at its very highest in the cycle. And this is the time in the cycle when women generally feel their best, right? So they generally have the highest level of energy. They have highest sexual desire. They feel sexy, right? They sound sexy. They move sexy. Women feel pretty good during this time. So you get ovulation. After ovulation, that empty egg follicle actually becomes a temporary endocrine structure, just meaning that it starts to release hormones. And so that empty egg follicle becomes what's called the corpus luteum, and it begins to release progesterone, this other hormone that we have. And it produces levels of progesterone that actually peak at levels that are 10 times higher than the peak levels of estrogen in the first half of the cycle, which is sort of interesting because, again, here it's this hormone that's been totally ignored, and it's released at these just astronomical levels during the second half of the cycle. And so after ovulation, progesterone is released, and it's released generally for about 12 to 14 days. This is the second half of your cycle. And so for the first half of the cycle, progesterone is rising. And then for the second half of the cycle, if conception does not occur, then it begins to fall. And then after, of course, the levels fall, that's when you get your period. So the whole thing starts over again. And essentially what's going on with this, with the rise and fall of estrogen and then the rise and fall of progesterone, is that the body is shifting, as I've said, like from a state that's optimized for attraction and sex, and then it's shifting into a state that's optimized for implantation and pregnancy. And it turns out that that's a lot of work.
Right.
It's like, it turns out that that's a lot of work for a human body to do. And it actually requires a lot more gear shifting and like switch flipping than you might think it does. And this is because preparing a body for pregnancy means essentially changing the order of operations for almost everything that goes on. Like you have to change the immune system to become more tolerant of, foreign material. And of course, this is because if you have an embryo that's trying to implant, it's going to have foreign DNA in it, and you have to be tolerant of that or else you're not going to allow it to implant. So you have to have immunological changes. There's vascular changes, or cardiovascular system changes, because there has to be a lot of extra blood flow to the uterine area, and differentiating all the cells of the endometrial layer is also something that requires a lot of vascularization, and it requires a lot of energy, right? And so like we find, for example, that women's basal metabolic rate increases by about 7 to 11% in the second half of the cycle, because this is such an energetically demanding task to sort of reorganize the body to be ready for the possibility of pregnancy. And so you get changes there. You get changes in sleep. You get changes in your ability to recover. You get changes in your respiration rate, where your respiration rate goes up and your heart rate variability goes down. And so there's all of these little switches that are flipping throughout the body. And ultimately, these have the result of making us a somewhat different version of ourselves than what we are in the first 2 weeks of the cycle. And so one of the things that, I talk about in the book is just the fact that for a lot of women, we feel a lot worse in that phase of the cycle than we need to, simply because nobody has told us what to expect. And we're treating ourselves according to one size fits all set of guidelines that we've been told about what it means to be human. And those don't necessarily fit for a woman.
The human body is really amazing, isn't it? Just like all of these things that happen, we have a lot of these simplistic understandings of the body, but once you start understanding like on a deeper level, what is really happening and all these massive changes that are taking place every single month, it's pretty crazy when you think about it.
It is. And I'll just say this, and that is that, I think for a really long time, our understanding, just because, men were studied first, and it was really long assumed that we could just study men and then apply the same wisdom that we learned from male bodies to females, because women are just nothing more than, smaller men with breasts and ovaries. But, in the last 50 years or so, I think it's become very clear, no matter what part of your body you're studying, that there is sex differentiation and that it matters and that it is really complex, as you say.
Yeah, and that's something that I want to dive into further in the next episode. I want to talk about all of the issues with the way science has treated women. The spark in your sex life isn't gone. It's probably just buried under these 3 common things: routine, stress, and lack of communication. Routine makes intimacy predictable. Stress steals your energy and desire. And not talking about what you really want means you're not going to get it. This is where Beducated can help. Beducated features over 150 expert-led courses designed to help put the spark back in your relationship and help you feel more connected than ever. One course I love to recommend is called Banish Bedroom Boredom, which is designed to help you rediscover sexual excitement with your partner. It walks you through what causes bedroom boredom in the first place, offers lots of creative ideas on how to spice up your sex life, and shares tips on how to communicate your fantasies and desires. One of the things I really like about it is that it teaches you how to co-create a fantasy. Sometimes partners don't share the same exact fantasies, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you aren't a match. But with a little creativity, you can create a new fantasy together that meets everyone's needs. Say goodbye to your dormant sex life and hello to a sex life reboot with Beducated. Beducated is where toe-curling pleasure meets expert-backed education. Get 50% off the yearly pass by using my last name, Leigh Miller, as the coupon code. Try Beducated risk-free with a 14-day money-back guarantee. What are you waiting for? Check the show notes for the link and be sure to use my last name to get your discount. For now, let's go back to the menstrual cycle. And, in the latter part of it, following ovulation, you enter the luteal phase, which is when progesterone begins to rise. And this is that time when PMS symptoms begin to emerge. And what's interesting is that progesterone is actually a hormone that's supposed to make us feel good, right? It's supposed to have all of these benefits like promoting better mood and well-being. And when women in menopause get hormone therapy and receive progesterone, it helps in relieving a lot of menopausal symptoms like issues related to mood. But in the luteal phase, when progesterone increases, women aren't experiencing a lot of positive effects. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So can you explain this to us? Why is this hormone that's supposed to make people feel good not having that effect in the luteal phase?
It is really interesting because when you look at especially the animal literature in the field of neuroscience and you look at the impacts that progesterone has, like sort of at a cellular level, it does all of these really beautiful things that are supposed to promote kind of a kumbaya feeling in the brain where you just feel really relaxed and calm. And of course, this is not exactly what most women feel across the cycle. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. And it kind of depends on what the issue is, because like I said, this hormone is all about nuance. And I think that that's another one of the reasons that people don't want to study it is because it's like, well, progesterone is very calming, except for when it's not. That's a very difficult answer to have, but it actually ends up being true. And so here's sort of the scoop on this. One, if we look at the menstrual cycle or just even let's just zero in on the luteal phase here for a moment. During the luteal phase, you have this 7-day period when progesterone levels are rising, and then you get a 7-day period when progesterone levels are falling. So when we talk about some of the beautiful neurobiological things that progesterone does, one of them is that it stimulates GABA receptors in the brain. And so GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter that the brain uses to calm itself down, right? So when you have an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it means that it literally makes the brain slower to respond to things, right? It just is kind of calming and soothing and chills you out. And so just to give you some tangible examples of what it feels like to have your GABA receptors stimulated, like doing yoga, meditation, and alcohol, right? Or benzodiazepines, all of these things activate your GABA receptors. And that's that sort of slowing feeling that you get, like if you have a glass of wine or you're sitting by the fireplace, and that relaxation is the result of usually GABA transmission in the brain. And so you have this hormone, progesterone, and when progesterone is metabolized by the body, one of the products that it breaks down into is this neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And allopregnanolone is a really potent modulator of GABAergic activity in the brain, which is just a really ugly way of saying that it calms your brain down, right? That it stimulates GABA receptors and then it causes that calming neurotransmission. And so what happens with some women when they're experiencing sort of bad mood across the cycle is that they're feeling fine during the first half of the luteal phase when progesterone levels are rising. And this is because they're getting increased GABAergic activity in the brain, which is kind of soothing and calming. And they're a little tired and those sorts of things, which is kind of a side effect of GABAergic activity. But, they're feeling pretty good. And then what happens is then progesterone levels begin to fall, right? And now you've got all of these GABA receptors that are just waiting for all that extra stimulation. And it's almost like they're naked, they're out there, trying to grab onto some calming neurotransmission and they're not getting it. And this can have the effect of creating anxiety. in women. And so, like, one of the things that we know from research, just looking at women who experience unpleasant mood related changes across the cycle and women who have an easier sort of transition between hormonal states, is that some women are just not very resilient to those hormonal changes. So some women, and it's primarily, at least according to the latest literature, there's always, science is a process. But the current wisdom in the field is that it's not so much about not having progesterone or having progesterone that's creating some of these unpleasant mood-related changes, but that rather it's just a rapid change in levels that creates these issues, and in particular when things are falling. And the idea is that some people, because they lack what we can just think of as like cellular plasticity, right? So they lack the type of plasticity of their cells where they're able to quickly rearrange themselves and be able to quickly adjust to changing levels of progesterone and then allopregnanolone. That if they're not able to quickly adjust to these changes, that it can very easily turn into a feeling of like withdrawal or like overwhelm from presence or absence of the hormone. And so this also seems to be an issue. And this is one of these individual differences that some of it, there is a genetic component. So people who have family members who have a really difficult time with hormonal transitions. And this is true, by the way, with hormonal transitions across the cycle. But also this tends to also correspond to hormonal changes in response to like postpartum after having a baby and hormonal changes that are happening in perimenopause and menopause. And so women who have bad PMS oftentimes also have a difficult postpartum period and also have a difficult perimenopause. And so part of it is like genetic, but there's also a lot of it that just has to do with, our resilience to hormonal changes is something that has been eroded by environmental changes that have happened in the last 200 years that have like kind of eroded our physical health. I mean, it's the usual suspects, right? Eating processed foods, not getting exercise, not having a community around you that helps to regulate your nervous system and your stress response, too much stress, not getting enough sleep, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some of that lack of resilience is something that's very addressable just simply by making lifestyle changes that can help promote the overall physical health of your body and, in turn, cellular plasticity.
Yeah, every time we talk about hormones on the show, I just realize how complex they are. Hormones don't have just like one effect. They all have multiple effects, and there's always these individual differences, and there's variation in how people respond to them. And so we like to think of hormones as kind of having like a simple and easy story to them. Like, for example, with something like oxytocin in the media, it's always referred to as the love hormone or the love drug. But it's like, oxytocin also can promote antisocial behaviors too. It's like there's never a simple and easy story with hormones.
No, there never is. The body is a mess of spaghetti. It's like it was not designed by an engineer.
No. So something that you talk about in the book that I think is really interesting is how progesterone changes sexual motivation and desire. So we know that during the follicular phase, when estrogen is high, that women tend to have more sexual desire and they tend to have more sex too, compared to the luteal phase when progesterone is high. But this doesn't necessarily mean that progesterone turns off all desire. Rather, it changes the nature of women's sexual motivation. So tell us a little bit about that. How is women's sexual motivation different across different phases of the cycle?
This to me is some of the most interesting of the research that we cover in the book. And I think that it's something that it's important for women to understand and their partners to understand, because I think that, again, most of our understanding of what is normal is based on this sort of male prototype of what normal is. And it doesn't always apply to females. And there's few things for which this is more true than with our sexual psychology. And as you noted, when estrogen is high and rising across the cycle, this is a time when women, have higher libido, right? They just want sex for the purpose of having sex. Like they have what, we would call spontaneous desire, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they're just like kind of minding their own business. Or like, what, I really want some sex. And that's more like male type of desire because men tend to have more spontaneous sexual desire than women. Women tends to be more responsive. And so, this is a time when women are having a spontaneous sexual desire. They also feel really sexy, which ends up being a really potent motivator of women's sexual behavior, which I'm sure you have spent time talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But for women, a lot of times, their feeling like wanting to have sex has as much to do with how sexy they feel as it is about how much they think that their partner is sexy. And so
Yep.
there's this like really intertwinedness, if that's a word, between women's feelings of sexiness and then their sexual desire. And so we get all of those wonderful things going on when sex can lead to conception, and obviously for obvious evolutionary reasons. And when we move into the second half of the cycle, to start with, I think we should all just take a minute to appreciate how cool it is that we still have sex at all,
Mhm.
because most species do not. And for most species, there is only sex during the fertile window. And then outside the fertile window, nobody's having any sex at all. And the reason that they're not having sex at all is because it is costly. Right. And so, I mean, obviously it's energetically costly, especially if you're doing it right. Right. Sex can be energetically costly. And it also can create inflammatory activity in the vaginal canal, which during the period when implantation is possible is not necessarily the best idea, right? Not necessarily the worst idea, but it's not the best idea. It's something that can increase the risk of having issues with implantation. And so, it's pretty remarkable that we have sex during this time at all, because most species do not. And they don't because it's costly. And so then that, of course, begs the question of like, what are we doing? Like, like why are we having sex during this period of time when conception isn't possible? And it turns out that it is because sex serves more than just one function, right?
Yep.
And we tend to reduce sexual activity, especially in the evolutionary sciences, oftentimes as being this thing that we do to procreate, but it's so much more than that, right? And also serves a really important function in terms of promoting and solidifying pair bonds. And this is what's going on in the second half of the cycle, right? The reason that humans and human females in particular continue to have sex throughout the cycle is because it does serve this really potent bonding function. And there's been some really interesting research both into the role that sexual behavior plays in terms of promoting bonding in humans, and then also sort of the role that the need to connect with your partner plays in terms of promoting luteal phase sexual behavior. And so I'll just first just march through some of the interesting things that we know about sex as a tool of bonding. And as you might imagine, there's a pretty nice body of research that suggests that sexual behavior and sexual activity plays an important role in terms of bonding organisms together, right? And this is true for things like prairie voles, which also form these long-term socially monogamous relationships. And is also true for humans. And when we look at sexual behavior, and this actually includes like sexual behavior that is orgasmic or non-orgasmic, actually promotes oxytocin and some of these things that can both make you xenophobic, right? like do some of these terrible things where you're like, anti-out group, but it really bonds you to your partner. The thing that oxytocin does is it essentially flags people as like in your brain as being really important, right? And of course, the downside to that is that these people are important and those people aren't being flagged as important. That's where the sort of outgroup thing pops in. But, one of the things that oxytocin does, and it gets released during sexual behavior, it promotes bonding with your partner, and it does solidify pair bonds. And one of my favorite studies looking at the role that sexual behavior plays in promoting pair bonds was this really great work done by Andrea Meltzer and some of her colleagues at Florida State, where they looked at the role that sexual afterglow actually plays in terms of promoting marital satisfaction and relationship satisfaction. And what they find is that, the length and intensity of sexual afterglow, that sort of warm, fuzzy feeling that you get after you've had sex with your partner, that this actually predicts relationship success over several days. And so afterglow lingers, much longer than most of us think that it does. And it plays a really important role, again, in terms of increasing feelings of connection to your partner. So really fascinating stuff. And so, one of the reasons that our female body is willing to incur the cost of sex, even when it's not conceptive, is that we get these pair bonding benefits, both in terms of our own feelings of connection to our partners, but then also our partner's feeling of connection to us. In fact, there's been research showing that when you look at luteal phase sexual behavior and sexual desire, it tends to be strongest among women who feel the most need to connect with their partners. So the more they're feeling like they are more invested in their relationship than their partner is invested in their relationship, these women have the strongest luteal phase sexual desire across the cycle relative to women who feel really safe and secure in their relationships, which again just gets at the fact that luteal phase sexual behavior in particular is less likely to be about scratching a sexual itch, right? Which is more about what's going on in the first half of the cycle. And that's because that sexual itch could potentially lead to conception, right? And so your brain is just like preoccupied by the idea of sex for sex, right? Whereas with the second half of the cycle, it's really more about doing things to increase closeness, increase the pair bond, increase feelings of connection across the cycle. And I think that this is important for people to understand for a couple of key reasons, right? One is understanding that the nature of female sexual desire changes across the cycle, I think is a really valuable insight for a woman or anybody who has a female partner, right? And if you are a male with a female partner, I think it's also really important for men to have this information. I think that like being able to communicate about these things can really open up and like a whole new chapter to your sexuality and the quality of the sex life with your partner, because it really will help you each be able to get and meet your needs in a way that you can't without this information. So for example, one thing that, given that luteal phase sexual behavior is more about connection and less about sort of getting a sexual release, it means that, a 5-minute one-off with your partner quickly before you go to work isn't going to hit the same way that it would a couple of weeks prior when you're in the fertile window, right? And so sex needs to be more in context and have the context of connection at that time. And that, just sort of like, hey, like I'm going to grab you from behind and then we're just like going to go at it and then I'm going to run to the office. That doesn't necessarily hit the right way. And sometimes, especially for men, because men have one hormone, right? And so every day is kind of the same, more or less sexually. I mean, hormonally speaking, obviously no 2 days are the same for a variety of other reasons. But they don't understand that. And a lot of women don't even understand it because if they aren't like given a language to think about what's going on, instead they are just like mad at their partner because this isn't hitting the right way. And instead it's making them feel like maybe there's a problem, right? Like my partner doesn't even want to hang out with me. They just want to have sex with me. Like maybe that's the only thing that they want me for. Like, and it can create this whole spiral that if you actually understand what's going on and that it's a different type of sexuality, it's oriented toward a totally different set of goals, that can allow you to be able to better set up the world in a way that's going to allow you to get what you need out of sex and allow your partner to give you what you need out of sex. Because I think most of the time, partners want to do that for each other. And that many times they just feel like they don't understand what's happening. And having that information, I think, is a really powerful tool. And in fact, I found in my own relationship that, it's just been an absolute game changer between sex and then mood, and the fact that your sort of anxiety thresholds change across the cycle also, where, if like, let's say that takes 3 instances of your partner doing something that's a little bit questionable before you start to think like, do they not love me enough? Right? If you're in the luteal phase of the cycle, it only takes like 1 instance, right? It sort of lowers our threshold of like when the alarm bells actually start to sound in our head, because the luteal phase and pregnancy is such a time of intense physical vulnerability for women. And so it's really important for them to be able to lean on their partners and have the support of their partners. And so they're more cautious because they have more to lose. And having these conversations about, okay, here's what's happening across the cycle, allowing each person to be able to understand like what the needs are is really just a fundamental game changer in terms of increasing closeness in the relationship and also minimizing misunderstandings.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really like and appreciate about your book is that you really try to help people better understand their own bodies, and you're giving them the scientific research and understanding necessary so that they have that comprehension, but then you're also giving them the tools they need to try and navigate these issues in their own lives. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Sarah. I'm really looking forward to digging even deeper into your work in the next episode because we have much, much more to discuss on this topic. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yeah, so you can buy The Period Brain anywhere that books are sold. So just go to your favorite indie retailer. You can go on Amazon. You can find it any way you want to that way. And it's also available as an audiobook if you're somebody who likes to listen to audiobooks when you're out walking around like I do. You can find me online. My website is sarahehill.com, and that is Sarah with an H. And you can find me on social media at Sarah E. Hill, PhD. And I'm on all channels, but most active on Instagram.
Well, great. I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.